I genuinely believe Congress in particular has been exceptionally generous in the last 5 to 7 years in terms of really trying to hear the pleas of, emerging tech startups and VCs in some cases, and better align incentive structures and pathways to ensure that we can kind of forward the type of ecosystem development and evolution that we've been trying to here in terms of both the defense industrial base and the larger sort of national security and innovation or industrial base, however you want to sort of term it.
This is All Quiet on the Second Front, a podcast where boring conversations around defense tech and national security come to die. Join me, Tyler Sweat, and my Second Front comrades as we dismantle the mundane, cut through the bureaucratic BS to demystify the world of defense tech. But be warned, this is not a typical government podcast. Ready to get weird? What's up, everybody? I'm your host, Tyler Sweat. Welcome to another episode of All Quiet on the Second Front, the podcast where boring defense talk comes to die. Really excited to have a longtime friend, colleague, at times mentor. So Jackie, thanks for swinging by today.
So good to be here. Thanks for having me.
We always try to give everybody a chance to get to know sort of who are you, what are you working on, what's your background, what brought you here. So give everybody like the 10,000 foot view. What are you up to?
Well, first of all, thank you again for having me, but also thanks for doing this pod. Like it's a really good one. It's a different one, which I appreciate. I think everybody appreciates it. And you're just doing great things. So, yeah. Okay, my background. So I really like to highlight that I'm a French and opera major and have zero business doing anything that I have done in my career, to include right now. So as you always say, dreams can come true. You can do anything.
Look at us.
Look at us. We're killing it. I came to DC a good number of years ago from Austin, Texas, Austin native. And I came because I was going straight into the government. I had become sort of obsessed with policy and defense policy in particular. And I started out actually at the CIA. I went into the Office of the Director of National Intelligence after that, then the Defense Intelligence Agency, and then I worked on the Hill for a while on the Intel Committee overseeing the defense portfolio. I went back into the Pentagon. I helped run the AI Center for a little bit. That's where I sort of got into kind of the emerging tech and national security space. I did that, by the way, because, as I mentioned, I've been obsessed with policy for a while, and I recognized throughout the course of my career in all of those different agencies and departments that we have a lot of policy and we have a lot of law, and nobody knows what it says and nobody knows how to use it. Yep. And the key is, if you actually read it, you can do really interesting things, and you can figure out how to do the things that you're trying to do and want to do. And so the sort of foray into emerging tech and sort of where I am now, which I'll talk about in a second, came from my time, again, in the community and then on the Hill, where I was able to write some legislation with some colleagues about how we could better sort of govern the space between defense and intelligence. So the sort of Title 10, Title 50 divide, for anybody listening that kind of knows that space. And really, the answer at the time was, we need technology to help us figure this out. There's too much policy. There's too much law to make sense of it. I was literally doing hand jamming analysis into spreadsheets from, non-OCR PDFs. It's so embarrassing, but that's where we were, right, in the government, and maybe still are in some cases. And so we built this capability in the DoD called GAMECHANGER, sort of a natural language processing capability, just to be able to ingest everything and figure out what it says.
Just make sense of it.
Make sense of it. I literally was working for, agency directors who would tell me, I want to do this thing. I ask my general counsel, I ask my policy advisors, I ask my entire leadership team and my CAG, like, can I do this thing? And I get 8 different answers based on the policy and the law, and like, nobody knows what it all says. And that's insane to me. Like, how do we run a country that way? How do we run a military that way? So the AI Center was a really interesting sort of opportunity for me, both to help build this capability that I was really excited about building and bringing to the department, but then also I got to see kind of what happens when you do get access to some of the most cutting edge capabilities that you've not historically had access to, and how do you put those in the hands of operators and users in a meaningful way at scale. Turns out real hard. Yep. as you may have figured out. Yep. And since then, I'm still an advisor to the Department of Defense in a sort of part-time capacity, but I've come out kind of in a full-time capacity. And most recently, I'm actually with a venture capital firm called Playground Global. So it's an early stage deep tech investing company. And I have the privilege of being dual-hatted, sort of helping to run the Silicon Valley Defense Group, which is a nonprofit organization. I know you've had Sam Gray, our previous fearless leader, on the show before, and a really, really interesting nonprofit that is very complementary to the work that I'm doing with both Playground and DoD in terms of bringing together the key stakeholders between the private capital community, the policymaker community, and the emerging tech and entrepreneurship community, and just trying to forge meaningful action.
It's a super interesting set of experience, right? Like, you talk about sort of like, hey, I'm a glutton for policy. I could argue you're a glutton for pain, right?
Same.
And just going through. Yeah. But I think the vantage point that offers you, having not just the experience sort of inside the institution, but the insight into the policy and the authorities and sort of maybe some of the boogeymen that are out there. How does that inform or influence your actions and how you're working with like portfolio companies and founders and operating teams when everyone's out there talking about like, hey, the government's got to make bets, they got to pick winners, like they're not allowed to do this. There's a bunch of boogeymen, for lack of a better term, out there. So walk me through that, because now you've been on both sides of a really interesting table.
Yeah. No, I mean, it obviously does. It affords a unique vantage point, I think, in some respects, just because I am that glutton for punishment. I do read Congressional Research Service reports by my bedside at night. Like, it is, I mean, it's embarrassing at some level, but also it's illuminating.
Some analyst just shed a tear and got his wings.
And GAO reports, I might add.
There you go.
Look, like, there are really, really thoughtful analysts, to your point, actually, out there doing a lot of hard work behind the scenes that like 2.5 people read. But if more people read those documents, and if more people truly kind of immerse themselves in this kind of policy landscape, I think what they would find, to your point about making big bets, about sort of, the challenges that we always talk about in the fora that we participate in, right? I cannot tell you how many times I have sat. I did this last week, 2 different fora, big ones, a think tank sponsored fora, and a small startup sort of demo day. Conversation after conversation after conversation, panel after panel, about the fact that like we need new authorities, we need new acquisition pathways, we need additional reform, et cetera. Like, I think that's fundamentally wrong. I genuinely believe that Congress in particular has been exceptionally generous in the last 5 to 7 years in terms of really trying to hear the pleas of emerging tech startups and VCs in some cases, and better align incentive structures and pathways to ensure that we can kind of forge the type of ecosystem development and evolution that we've been trying to here in terms of both the defense industrial base and the larger sort of national security and innovation or industrial base, however you want to sort of term it. But to your question, when it's hard, right? Because when you hear a really, really smart person that's been doing things in this space for a very long time say, we need X, we can't do Y, it's really hard to say, hey, sir, ma'am, have you actually read the policy? Because you technically can. And what you really need is a campaign plan, frankly, in terms of how to take this and make it into what you're trying to achieve. A couple of champions and advocates, which are not hard to find at this point because we are having these conversations so fulsomely in so many different places. But what you really need, and like this is just kind of my hobby horse at this point, is like you need intestinal fortitude at the leadership level, period. End of story. You need to hold people accountable for using the authorities and the mechanisms and vehicles that you have at your disposal, far or non-far, I don't care. And you just need some people to sort of take, it's not even taking risks because, well, it is perceived to be taking risks, right? It's not taking risks because you genuinely do have the law on your side. The people that I guess technically need to take the risks are the people that are going to back you up when you do the thing that you're supposed to do.
Yeah, and I think it's, you can hear Bonnie Evangelista and other folks say the same thing. Like, hey, we've got all of the authorities we need. Like, Congress has given us the tools. We've got to use them. There's an aspect of that I think is internal to the government where, leaders have to lead and sort of step up, and, the procurement teams or the program teams got to push forward. There's a part on the outside about making sure sort of the companies and their advisors and their broader sort of go-to-market or engagement teams are aware and informed and can also help sort of coach and mentor.
Yep.
And then I think where we start to see some of the larger wins are, and we can talk about, CCA, or we can talk about Australia. There have been a couple, I think, in recent months, like pretty large scale kind of needle mover, like the SpaceX for NASA in defense. Give me that perspective. Like, what signal does that send? One, inside the department, and then two, outside, as you're sitting at sort of at that intersection of capital allocators and regulators and legislators and buyers and all of that. What's that say to the market?
Yeah, and look, I'll talk actually more about an announcement that was recently made about a company called PsiQuantum, which is a quantum computing hardware company out of Palo Alto. It's one of the portfolio companies that Playground has. It's actually a company that I was working for before I joined Playground. And I'll talk less about CCA just because it's been pretty well covered to this point, which is great, and super excited about that announcement as well. The PsiQuantum announcement was really interesting. Obviously, I was tracking sort of its progression and very, very pleased that it ultimately came out. The announcement was that the Australian Commonwealth Government, in partnership actually with one of their state governments, the government of Queensland, is making a very significant, especially for Australia, sort of historically, investment in the company. A US-based company, by the way, but founded by 2 Aussies and 2 Brits. So very much wrapped in the AUKUS flag, which is a nice place to be. Making an investment both in terms of equity, so making a significant investment in the Series E that the company is launching now, as well as putting in significant money in terms of grants and money for an actual production site. So this is Australia's bid to have the first utility scale fault tolerant quantum computer on its soil, and it says a couple of things to me. One, it says in a really, really beautiful way that governments can do the thing that we always ask them to do, which is their science minister put out a couple of months ago a national quantum strategy. I believe it was their first. And in that strategy, and by the way, this predates the negotiations with PsiQuantum and anybody else that they were potentially in negotiations with. The strategy said, we are going to have a fault-tolerant utility-scale quantum computer on our soil. We are going to make a significant investment. And however that plays out, whatever that means, whether that's we're building it here, whether that's we're buying it, whatever it means, like, we know that this technology is coming. It's coming much sooner than people anticipate or appreciate. And we know that in order to not miss this technological wave, we have to be ready to make a significant financial investment in bringing this here. So you've put it out in your strategy. You've said it's going to happen. You've given it a rough kind of timeline of like the next few years. And then not a year later, you announce that you're making this very significant investment. I mean, to the tune of roughly $1 billion Australian dollars, which is about 650 million US. And you're going to deal with any repercussions of the local ecosystem saying you've awarded to a U.S. company. Understand the Australian roots, and very glad to bring those roots back and have the capability here. But the government said it was going to do something, chose arguably, and certainly in my mind, the most capable company of doing that, irrespective of where that company sat in their own ecosystem. And said, nope, like this is the horse we're betting on. We're going to bet big. It's a lot of dollars. And we're going to take whatever the media or anybody else throws at us about our decision, because the reality is we need this technology, period. That's the goal, not the goal of awarding to a particular company, not the goal of, the cheapest bid, like none of that. It's about getting the right thing. And so I think the signal that it sends is this can happen. Yep. Like the thing that we constantly are asking for to happen can actually happen. B, my question then to the United States government, right, with whom we're working very closely, both with PsiQuantum and many other PERCOs, is then like, what are you doing, guys, right? So glad that you're one of, if not your closest allied partner, is going to have this capability, but like, where's yours? Yeah. Where's ours? Right. And also like take a page out of this book, like put it on paper. We always do the first part. We do the strategy, we do the put it on paper part, and then the follow through doesn't seem to be there. And so the signal is there, which is great. The signal also, obviously, from a private capital perspective, helps significantly in the companies Series E and other quantum computing and quantum technologies companies sort of assessment of whether or not there's going to be sustained, non-dilutive capital for investment in these technologies, R&D and otherwise. And then the question is like, the proof is in the pudding. What happens next? Yep.
So taking that sort of win from the Australian lens, bringing it back to U.S., right? This might be the spicy area, but like we're going to see where we go.
Okay. I love spicy.
Election year, CR, what? Right? CR, money. I think everyone sort of high-fived themselves thinking like a month ago, 2 months ago, oh, cool, the money all moved.
Yep.
Like we're still waiting in places for money to hit. So we're in what? May. So we're now in like a 4-month window for DoD to spend all of this money. Help me rationalize, like if I'm on the outside as a founder or an operator, or I'm another investor, and I see on one hand, all of this fad around defense tech and everyone sort of, taking buses to the Gundo and all of that.
I can't.
And on the other side, I've got an $800 billion budget that gets literally dropped into the spigot with 4 months to disperse the entire thing. How do I then look at the department as a serious buyer and as someone who's deliberate so that they can even do what you just said?
Yeah. I mean, look, it's an impossible question to answer because
this is a safe space.
I appreciate that.
And it's not fishing for an I got you. I mean, it's a genuine, because I struggle with it. I'm like, it's hard to take it seriously if we're going to behave like kids who are learning how to run the grocery store in kindergarten.
No, I think that's absolutely right. The interesting part of this, right? I mean, there are a lot of sort of like interesting case studies that you could do, but one of the things that we at Silicon Valley Defense Group have been sort of like talking about and looking at recently is like, what does what you just described do to the currently what I would sort of term as like saturated defense tech market, both in terms of companies that are entering it or trying to enter it, and in terms of funders that are trying to play in it. How do you sift through the noise when you have this kind of like operational environment with respect to like the spending and everything else? And it's not just a question, right? For like, so the way that you pose the question, which is fully valid, is like, what does that do in terms of the signal to the founders and to the investors? But it's also like, how does the government even discern between serious players that are going to be here long term, that are going to like wade through the slog and ridiculousness of trying to deal with these types of budgets and cycles and timelines and uncertainties? And so it's kind of like this really inefficient and ineffective dance on both sides, right? Like trying to sniff each other out and figure out like who's in this for real, who's in this for the long term, but also like for those that are real, for those that are in this for the long term, for those of us, right, who have devoted most of our adult lives to federal service in one way or another and still are doing that from different vantage points in different places. Like I do think that there does need to be some real focus on creating incentives to play to stay.
Yeah.
However, and this is like a really like unfortunate way to answer your question, like I don't know what those incentives have to look like, and that's what I've been trying to figure out. We have been having a lot of conversations with both sort of like policymaker partners and with industry partners. Like, what would those incentives have to? Well, let me ask you. Right, you're a CEO of a pretty cool tech startup.
We're getting there.
Like, what would an incentive look like for you to not just like play in a meaningful way as you already are, but like stay?
Yeah, I mean, I think there'll be different personas or different levers, but I think everybody always talks about the department picking winners in terms of like capital disbursement and contracts, right? And it's like the Oprah Winfrey, but for like programs of record.
You get a tank.
Yeah, but I actually think like if the department, just imparted opinionation and was like firm on it, you could create a lot of market dynamics and get a lot of the benefit of like, innovation and some of the efficiencies, but with a lack of opinionation around data, intellectual property. I mean, even the simple question of like, okay, if I'm the government and I have all of the reams of training data, right? Like, and I say, hey, I'm going to allow you, AI company X to come in with a model you've built using private capital, all of your own volition. I'm going to allow it to train on this. And then, maybe I get government rights to that version. But like, what about all of the derivative works that sit in there? It is obfuscated at best as to what the intent of the government is there. And if you said, hey, what we're going to do is we're going to get to use that one thing, model version 1.3 that you train this for this use case, but like you guys can feed back your learning and be creating derivative product and you own that. That's an easy way to bring folks in and be like, oh, cool. I'm not now in some very complicated page 72 of a contract with some robot on like what is restricted versus limited versus government purpose, general purpose. Like, who the fuck knows what most of that means? Most KOs can't tell you what it means. So I think that's where I'd want the government to pick winners.
And so I'm totally with you. And now I'm sort of like hearkening back to my time at the, was the Jake now the CDAO? Because in my mind, I'm like, okay, great. Like whose job, let's just take the Department of Defense. Whose job would it be to figure out this government purpose, right? Sort of like break down what this looks like. And as I think through with, no ill intent to past, present, or future employees of any of these entities, I don't believe that we have the people with the like long-standing skill sets and expertise and experience in these types of negotiations to make those determinations.
I would agree. I mean,
it's not an excuse.
I think part of it is like, like I can bitch that somebody can't farm if I've like never given them a tractor, seed, or water, and I can be like, oh, the old man shakes his hand at the sky. And like it's to retort back with like not impugning blame on like an entity, but like if we are unopinionated on material technical things,
yes.
Why do I have thousands of employees writing technical policy for senior technical leaders in the department?
Totally.
That is where it just doesn't comport for me.
Nope.
And that's not a single human. I think it is just there is like this like cornucopia of bullshit happening.
Yeah.
There's policy fratricide,
of course,
all over the place. I've now got local exemptions. I've got field CDOs and CTOs and CIOs and all over the place. And there's no sort of coherent policy linkage. I think to go all the way back to where you sort of started on that fortitude, like someone's got to want to just wrap their arms around this and say like, okay, these are the 3 or 4 bets we're going to make at a, design pattern, IP, market react.
Yeah.
And we're going to stick with it. And then the market will form around that.
Yeah.
But absent that, we're in just this series of like weird multi-year procurements, or it's like SIBRs and OTs, right? And nobody understands what is the next sort of evolution look like.
So, I mean, I'm always thinking, obviously, about, is there a role for, and what is the role, if the answer is yes, for Silicon Valley Defense Group, right, to sort of play in this space. And I certainly think, given the conversations that I've had recently and in that hat, that there is. Yeah. The question is, like, who are the right initial government partners for that discussion, for that sort of mapping of the policy landscape, to sort of say, like, okay, this is what it looks like today, and here are, to your point, the 3 areas that we know we need to figure out and then let the market react to. I don't know. Do you have an opinion on that? Where would you start?
I would start. I don't want to put anybody on blast.
Do it.
It would be a 2-pronged approach, though, right? Like, I would talk to some of the technical staff up on the Hill and get an understanding of, like, their intent and expectations, just to make sure we're nested. And then, like, look, there are service CTOs that are breaking a ton of ground right now.
Yep.
There are like some strong data-centric leaders in, some of the COCOMs and, some of those subordinate units. And I would start small and, like, look at this, like, instead of how do I move the department, I would be like, cool, how do I get the first win?
Yep.
And then how do I build on that? And then the second and the third and the fourth. And next thing you know, you get a freaking revolution.
Yeah.
That's probably what I do.
No, I like that. Yeah, I mean, right, like, also, not to put people on blast, but I totally will in a good way. Like Justin Finale, who I'm sure is an example that you would have thought of.
Who I was referring to.
Who I was speaking to last night about joining me here today. Yeah. But he chose the NSA and said, I'm sorry to tell you.
I'm sorry.
I told him the same thing. He recently actually came on a webinar that SVDG did about sort of the mission outcomes per dollar, the sort of framework that he's putting into place for the Navy, which is
awesome.
It's awesome. So I think you're right. Like, starting with, and that is, it's funny. I'm glad that you asked the question. I'm glad we had the discussion, because even somebody as willing to break glass as I am, and I think throughout my career I've demonstrated that I am, like, just by virtue of, like, how we're trained to think about and react to things in this space, my immediate thought when you asked the question was like, okay, well, which office in the department would we have to start with? And,
but
like,
that's so logical.
I know, but, like, it shouldn't be. Like, we should. Thank you for making me better, Tyler. I appreciate you.
Growth.
No, I think, look, there's a ton of opportunity right now. There's also a ton of risk, right? Like, the reality is there are some excellent things that have happened in the last few years that could be really, really important and meaningful signals to the market, to the people that have devoted their lives to, and want to continue doing this. The question is, are they actual signals, or are they sort of, things that we are desperately hoping are signals that are actually not going to sort of materialize? Yeah.
I get that. I think there's a part of me, and this will lead into the last question here, but, like, I'm going to, despite, I think everyone thinking I'm a pessimist, I think I am an eternal optimist.
You are,
I just
for sure. Yeah.
wrap myself in pessimism so it doesn't hurt as much.
Fair
it's
enough.
The Jersey emo in me. So Queen for a day, right? It's the structure last question, right? You get to wave the wand, change one thing. We've gone through policy and authorities and leadership and picking winners and capital and budgets and all of that. Like, what's the one thing you change and why?
This would not happen in a day, of course. But the thing that I would set into motion, and I feel very strongly about, that I hope sort of encapsulates everything that you just said, is if we used refactored code to create and model policy and policy changes, if we treated policy as code, or code as code, right? Like, if you want to sort of do a play on words with the US code, and you could actually see the impacts of your, thank you, I appreciate you. See the impacts of your. It took me a second.
I was like, code is code.
Code as code.
I was like,
code is code.
Meta.
You're welcome, guys. We could actually not only cost out, theoretically, the cost of a policy change or a policy revision or a policy rescission, but we could model the impact on all of the other areas of policy and law that you don't actually think about because you're making a change on acquisition policy and you don't think
mutability as well. Yeah. Ooh,
So
that's interesting.
that's
Game changer, if you will.
it's a game breaker.
Oh,
That's
there it is.
it's coming.
It's coming. I
It's
like
coming.
it.
Yeah.
Heard it here first.
Yeah.
So, dude, always a pleasure.
So
One
fun.
of my favorite people to riff
So
with.
fun.
Thank you for making some time today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Great to be here.
Thanks, everybody. Cheers.